One moment changed everything. It happened on a quiet night in Indianapolis when nobody was really watching, or so it seemed at first. Sophie Cunningham was about to become the person the internet couldn't stop talking about, but on June 17, 2025, she was just doing what she'd been brought in to do, protecting her teammate. The Indiana Fever had just beaten Connecticut 88-77, a win that should have been routine, forgotten within hours. Instead, it became the foundation for one of the most unexpected rise-to-fame stories women's basketball has ever seen. The outcome on the scoreboard didn't matter. What happened in the final moments would matter more than anything that came before it, more than the 71 points combined, more than the playoff advancement. It would matter for reasons nobody could have predicted when that whistle blew. Within 24 hours, a $400 fine would become a $1 million windfall. Within weeks, a role player would become a household name. Within months, she'd land a $2 million deal with equity. This isn't about basketball. This is about what happens when the system tries to silence you and accidentally amplifies your voice instead. This is the story of how the WNBA accidentally created its newest star. Cunningham's role with the Fever wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. She'd signed on after several seasons with Phoenix, taking a spot on the roster that went beyond statistics on a box score. The organization brought her in specifically to be what's often called a physical presence, a veteran who could body up, get vocal, and absorb contact so their franchise player didn't have to. Caitlin Clark was the franchise player, the rookie who'd already absorbed more physical punishment than any first-year player in league history. Everyone knew it. The Fever organization knew it. The other teams in the league knew it. Clark had become a lightning rod for contact, whether intentional or not. Every night brought new chances for opposing players to test her, to see how much she'd take, to find the limits of the officiating crews that were supposed to protect her. The Fever organization brought Cunningham in to change that dynamic. They brought her in to make sure that if someone was going to take cheap shots at their rookie sensation, they'd have to answer for it. Nobody around the Fever organization was surprised when Cunningham stepped into that protective role fully. It was literally what they'd signed her to do. What surprised them was how fast the moment would arrive and what would happen when it did. The third quarter of that June 17th game had been a mess of inconsistency. Jewel Lloyd poked Clark in the eye during a shoving match. It should have drawn something, a technical, maybe a flagrant. The refs gave Lloyd nothing. Nothing at all. That was the first sign that something was off with the officiating that night. Then Connecticut's Marina Mabrey shoved Clark to the floor, and instead of targeting the player who actually threw the unnecessary contact, the referees hit Clark with a technical foul. Then they hit Tina Charles with one. The inconsistency wasn't subtle. It wasn't a judgment call that reasonable people could disagree on. It was the kind of thing that builds resentment in a locker room, that makes players feel like the league isn't protecting their own stars, that makes protective teammates start thinking about doing something about it themselves. Lloyd's foul eventually got upgraded to a flagrant, a decision that came too late and felt hollow compared to what Mabrey had gotten away with. The message was clear to anyone watching. The league was going to let some things slide. Some players were going to get protected. Others weren't. The system wasn't fair. It wasn't even trying to appear fair. With less than a minute left in the game and the outcome completely decided, Cunningham made her choice. She wasn't going to let this stand. She wasn't going to watch her franchise player get treated this way and do nothing about it. Lloyd was driving to the basket. Cunningham caught her, wrapped her arms around her neck, and pulled her straight down to the floor. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't calculated. It was direct, physical, and in front of a national broadcast audience. The court exploded. Both teams rushed in. Players who'd been sitting on the bench suddenly found themselves in a scrum. Lindsay Allen got ejected alongside Cunningham. When the dust settled and the officials had made their decision, Cunningham had been given a flagrant 2 and sent out. The league would later fine her $400. On paper, it looked like the end of a normal story. A player makes a bad decision, gets ejected, gets fined, and life moves on. The league office would file it away. It would become a line item in a transaction report. Nobody in the league office could have predicted what was about to happen next because they were thinking about it like a punishment. They were thinking about it like something that would make Cunningham regret her decision, something that would make her more careful about how she played defense going forward. Cunningham was thinking about it like a statement. She didn't apologize. She didn't distance herself. Instead, she posted a lighthearted photo to her Instagram stories, embracing the chaos like she'd meant it all along. That willingness to own the moment rather than hide from it became just as important as the foul itself. Fans picked up on it immediately. This wasn't a player trying to salvage her reputation. This was a player who'd done what needed to be done and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. There was also the texture that most people didn't know about yet. Cunningham and Lloyd had collided earlier in the season, and that collision had left Cunningham with a chipped tooth. It was the kind of detail that only emerged later, once reporters started digging into the history between these two players. Once it did emerge, it gave the narrative exactly what stories like this need: history, escalation, a rivalry boiling over at exactly the right moment. The broadcasters covering the game in real time seemed almost as shocked as the players themselves. Commentary immediately focused on whether Cunningham had crossed a line, whether her response matched the severity of what Mabry and Lloyd had been doing to Clark. That debate, happening live on national television, only added fuel to a story that was already spreading faster than anyone realized. The algorithm was already working. The clips were already being shared. Social media was already turning this into something bigger than a single playoff game in June. Within 24 hours, the clip had spread across every corner of the internet. Every social media platform, every sports outlet, every corner of the basketball world had seen Sophie Cunningham drag Lloyd to the floor. The image was striking, one player taking another to the ground in a moment of pure, unfiltered protection. It wasn't complicated. It didn't require you to understand the context of what had happened earlier in the game. It just required you to see a player willing to take the consequences for defending her teammate. That simplicity was part of what made it spread so fast. You didn't need to be a basketball expert to understand what was happening. You didn't need to follow the WNBA closely. You just needed to see a moment of raw authenticity and understand that this person meant what she was doing. Her follower count started moving in ways that don't happen to role players. 300,000 followers before the incident. That was her baseline. That was where she stood before June 17th changed her life. 500,000 new followers in a single day. Just gone. The algorithm had decided that Sophie Cunningham was worth paying attention to. Within weeks, she'd crossed 1 million followers on TikTok alone. That kind of growth trajectory is usually reserved for musicians launching new albums, celebrities going through scandals, or athletes who have built their brands over decades of consistent excellence. Cunningham had compressed an entire career's worth of social media growth into a matter of weeks because of a single moment of authenticity. Sportico, one of the most respected outlets covering sports business and athlete valuation, ran the actual numbers and came back with a figure that made the $400 fine look almost comical. $1 million. That's what they calculated she'd gained in personal value within 72 hours of that play. The math was staggering when you actually did the calculation. One $400 fine against $1 million boost in personal brand value. The numbers didn't even live in the same universe. It was the kind of disparity that made people pay attention. It was the kind of disparity that made sports business writers who'd never covered the WNBA before suddenly find themselves writing about Sophie Cunningham. Analysts started citing her as a case study in what sports economists call proximity value, the financial benefit an athlete captures simply by being close to the biggest star at exactly the right moment. But it wasn't just about being near Caitlin Clark physically. It was about defending her in a way the league hadn't. It was about doing what the referees should have done. It was about taking the fine and the ejection rather than letting the moment pass unchallenged. The internet had a name for her within days: the enforcer. It stuck immediately because it captured exactly what people were responding to. Cunningham hadn't been chasing a highlight. She hadn't been performing for cameras or trying to create a viral moment. She'd been protecting her teammate against a league that, in the eyes of millions of people, had failed to do the same. That authenticity resonated in ways that marketing departments spend millions of dollars trying to manufacture. You can't script this kind of moment. You can't create this kind of organic connection with an audience. You can't pay for the kind of genuine reaction that comes from watching someone do something real and unfiltered. Brands moved fast. Ring approached her almost immediately about a partnership. They saw the momentum, and they saw the demographic reach. Quest Nutrition and Adidas suddenly had more visibility around her than they'd ever had, and they had years of existing relationships to build on. She picked up an analyst role on Phoenix Suns broadcasts, a media career suddenly layered on top of an already exploding basketball brand. Teams that had overlooked her before were suddenly interested in what she had to say. Networks that had never called wanted her commentary. This wasn't about her basketball statistics. Her stats hadn't changed. She was still the same player she'd been before the foul. What had changed was the perception. What had changed was the attention. How rare is it for a role player in her 7th professional season to become the most talked about story in her entire sport? Historically, almost unheard of. Most athletes build their brand across years, incrementally, consistently, carefully. They work on their image. They hire consultants. They craft their public statements. They try to control the narrative. Cunningham had compressed an entire career's worth of brand development into a single week simply by being herself and refusing to apologize for it. Industry observers struggled to find anything comparable in recent WNBA history. This was new. This was different. This was what happened when the algorithm met authenticity, and the algorithm decided that authenticity was worth spreading. What made the Cunningham story different from typical viral sports moments was that it didn't fade. Most clips have a shelf life measured in days. The algorithm moves on. People find something new to talk about. A new controversy emerges. A new game happens. A new scandal breaks. The sports world moves fast, and viral moments that seem to dominate the conversation on Monday are forgotten by Friday. Cunningham had other plans. If anything, the attention seemed to embolden her further. She wasn't going quiet once the news cycle moved on. She was just getting started. She understood something that most athletes don't understand, that in the modern sports landscape, silence doesn't protect you. Silence makes you forgettable. The only way to stay relevant is to keep giving people reasons to talk about you. Her teammates and coaches around the Fever organization noticed the shift immediately. Internally, Cunningham's role had always been valued. The coaching staff knew what she brought to the team. The front office knew they'd made the right decision bringing her in. The veterans in the locker room respected what she did, but internally valued and nationally recognized are two completely different things. Externally, everything changed overnight. She'd gone from a dependable veteran fighting for minutes to a genuine drawing card in her own right. Opponents would ask about her before games now. Media outlets would seek her out for interviews. Fans would hold signs with her name on them. Opposing teams took notice of this shift. Coaching staffs across the league began preparing specifically for the physical, vocal presence she brought to the floor. She was becoming a matchup consideration, not just a depth player. Every time Indiana took the floor, the energy around her was different. Every time her name was announced, there was reaction. Every time she made a play, people were watching. The Fever organization realized they had stumbled onto something valuable. They hadn't just signed a role player. They'd signed someone who could move the needle, who could generate attention, who could make their brand more interesting simply by being herself. That value extended beyond the basketball court. It extended into sponsorships and partnerships and opportunities that most players never get. It extended into the kind of business potential that rarely finds its way to bench players averaging under 9 points a game. The league, apparently, decided that something needed to change. It decided that more fines would be the answer. This is where the story takes a turn that nobody could have predicted. This is where the WNBA made the decision that would ultimately amplify Cunningham's voice rather than silence it. On July 18, 2025, Cunningham posted a TikTok video. She was lip-syncing the lyrics "Stupid" or "Is it slow?" and aiming it directly at the league's officiating. It was criticism wrapped in humor, pointed but not vicious. She wasn't being outrageous. She was being honest in a way that resonated with fans who felt the same way about the inconsistency they'd been watching all season. The league fined her $500. This was the league trying to establish a boundary. This was the league saying that if you're going to criticize our officials, there will be consequences. If the goal was to make her more careful about what she said publicly, it didn't work. Not even slightly. The clip spread faster than the fine itself did. Sports media outlets covered the fine and the TikTok together, which meant that millions of people saw the video who would have never seen it otherwise. Fans who'd never watched a full WNBA broadcast found themselves debating officiating standards purely because of a 15-second video. Cunningham had just demonstrated an important truth about the modern sports landscape. Fines are free marketing if you have something authentic to say. Every fine seemed to function less like a punishment and more like a promotional trigger, pushing her name back into headlines just as the previous news cycle was fading away. The timing was almost perfect from a publicity perspective. Just when the conversation about Cunningham was starting to die down, another fine would emerge and bring her back into the center of the narrative. The league kept trying. Cunningham kept not stopping. She'd made a calculation that seemed to be working perfectly. The fine was worth the visibility. The controversy was worth the coverage. The criticism was worth the attention. And with every iteration, she was building something that extended far beyond basketball. 10 days after the TikTok fine, Cunningham launched her own podcast, Show Me Something, produced with The Volume. The debut came on July 28, 2025, and she used it exactly the way anyone who'd watched her all season should have expected. She leaned into the controversy. She addressed the officiating head-on. She called WNBA officiating inconsistent. She said if she were a ref, she'd mess up too, but that when calls were simple and right in front of your face multiple times, there was something deeper going on. She was speaking an honest frustration that millions of people had felt watching the league's calls all season. She was articulating what fans had been screaming at their televisions about. The podcast format gave her something that social media couldn't. It gave her time. It gave her space to develop ideas, to explain her perspective, to make her case in a way that a TikTok or an Instagram post couldn't. She wasn't limited to a few seconds. She could go deep. She could be nuanced. She could talk about the inconsistencies in officiating across the entire season, not just the moments that had directly affected her. The podcast became an outlet for everything she'd been thinking about, everything she'd been observing, everything she had insight into from being on the court every night. The league found her again, $1,500 this time for comments made on her own podcast. This was a significant escalation from the $500 fine for the TikTok. The league was essentially saying that if you're going to use a platform to criticize us, the price is going to go up. She found out about it the way most suspensions happen in sports, pulled aside by her general manager, Amber Cox, told that league office had been in touch. It's a formal process. It's meant to be intimidating. It's meant to make you feel like you've crossed a line. Rather than backing down, she addressed it head-on during that same debut episode. You fining me $500 isn't going to do it, she said. Then I'll get fined for that. Then I'll get fined for this. And the fines will continue. She was essentially predicting the pattern that was about to unfold. She was saying to the league, you can fine me, but I'm not going to stop. This is worth it to me. This is worth more than the money you're fining me. This is about principle. This is about speaking truth. This is about not letting an institution silence you when you have something to say. The fans understood what was happening. They understood that Cunningham was choosing principle over compliance. They understood that she was willing to take the financial hit because the value she was getting from the attention, from the platform, from the brand she was building, was worth more than any fine. August answered that question quickly. She picked up a third fine in August after commenting on officiating involving Paige Buchers in a Wings Fever matchup. The amount wasn't even disclosed publicly, which is interesting in itself. Maybe the league was embarrassed about the pattern at this point. Maybe they realized that announcing the fines was just giving her more platform. Maybe they were starting to understand that every fine was backfiring. I love Paige to death, she'd said on the podcast, but those refs were giving her every freaking whistle last night. It was mild criticism. It wasn't personal, it wasn't vicious, it was observation. Afterward, she summed up her entire season in one line for reporters. I'm officially 3 for 3 on being fined by the WNBA. They didn't like my comments on Paige Buchers. I didn't even say anything bad. By all accounts, she was laughing about it, entirely unbothered by a pattern that would have rattled most athletes navigating their first real national spotlight. She turned the fines into a badge of honor. She turned the league's punishment into proof of her authenticity. Every fine was a sign that she was saying things the league didn't want said. Every fine was a sign that she was speaking truth to power. How many players actually get more popular every single time the league tries to discipline them? Vanishingly few. But that appeared to be exactly what was happening with Sophie Cunningham. Her podcast download numbers climbed with every new fine. Sponsors took notice. A pattern that should have functioned as a deterrent instead became something closer to a marketing calendar. 3 separate news cycles spaced perfectly across a single summer, each one driven by a league decision to fine her. The league had essentially created a content calendar for Cunningham's brand, without even trying. Without any intention to help her, they'd become her unwitting promotional partners. Each fine followed roughly the same process. A comment or a post would emerge. The league would review it. A dollar figure would be attached. A statement would be issued that rarely elaborated beyond the basic facts of the violation. That consistency, ironically, made Cunningham's response feel even more compelling by comparison. Where the league offered procedure, she offered personality. Where the league offered bureaucracy, she offered authenticity. Audiences overwhelmingly preferred the personality. Her voice was more authentic than any official statement, more relatable, more real. She wasn't reading from a script. The league was reading from one. That contrast was everything. The business implications of what was happening weren't subtle to anyone paying attention. Sportico ran new calculations. Ring renewed her deal with increased terms. Quest Nutrition expanded the scope of her partnership. Adidas wanted more visibility. The Sun's broadcast gig became permanent. Her podcast was climbing the sports podcast rankings. She was becoming one of the most valuable athletes in the WNBA, not because of her on-court performance, but because of her ability to generate attention and engagement. Every fine, rather than diminishing her brand value, was adding to it. Then in September, Cunningham's season ended earlier than anyone wanted. She suffered a torn MCL and missed the rest of the 2025 campaign. 30 games played, 13 starts, 8.6 average, 3.5 rebounds, shooting nearly 47% from the field and over 43% from 3. The Fever won the Commissioner's Cup that season, adding another $30,000 to her total earnings for the year. It was a nice bonus, but it paled in comparison to what she was making off the court. Could an injury actually slow down a business trajectory moving this fast? It barely made a dent. Her podcast kept growing. The audience grew because she had more time to develop the show now that she wasn't traveling with the team constantly. She could record multiple episodes. She could bring on guests. She could develop a structure and rhythm. Recurring broadcast appearances continued. Her weekend slots with the Suns became something fans looked forward to. Brands kept lining up regardless of whether she was actively playing. If anything, the injury gave her more free time to build the exact media presence that had already started paying off in ways her basketball salary never could. She had clarity now about what her future looked like. It wasn't primarily going to be about basketball statistics. It was going to be about building a media company with herself as the center. Watching from the sidelines seemed to sharpen her voice rather than soften it. Without games to focus on, without the physical demands of being a professional athlete, Cunningham leaned further into podcasting and media appearances. She turned what could have been a lost stretch of the season into one of the most productive off-court runs any WNBA player had managed in a single year. Every appearance added another layer to a brand that had started improbably with a single hard foul in June. She was becoming a complete media package. She was developing her voice as a commentator. She was becoming someone networks wanted on their broadcasts. She was becoming someone brands wanted to associate with. The narrative around her evolved during this period. She wasn't just the enforcer anymore. She was becoming a voice of authenticity in professional sports. She was someone willing to say what others were thinking. She was someone who refused to be managed by institutional power structures. That resonated with audiences in a moment when so much of sports discourse felt scripted and corporate. Fans were hungry for someone real, someone raw, someone who spoke their mind. Cunningham was providing exactly that. By the time the 2026 season approached, she'd already transcended basketball in many ways. She was a podcaster. She was a broadcaster. She was a brand ambassador. She was a voice in the conversation about sports culture and athlete authenticity. She was someone who'd proven that you could succeed in the modern sports landscape without conforming to what institutions wanted you to be. In fact, she'd proven that refusing to conform was more valuable than conforming ever could be. The WNBA had wanted her to be quiet. Instead, she'd become louder. The WNBA had wanted her to apologize. Instead, she doubled down. The WNBA had wanted her to disappear. Instead, she'd become impossible to ignore. Then in November 2025 came the deal that changed everything. Not the fines, not the podcast, not the sponsorships. The deal that fundamentally transformed Sophie Cunningham from a basketball player with a media side hustle into a business executive. Cunningham signed with Project B, a brand new 5-on-5 women's basketball league planning to tour Asia and Europe beginning in late 2026. The contract was $2 million. This wasn't a playing salary in the traditional sense. This was an equity stake in the league itself. She wasn't just being hired to play basketball. She was being brought in as a partner. The structure was typically reserved for athletes with far more traditional star power, the kind of athletes who'd been building their brands for decades. LeBron James gets equity deals. Serena Williams gets equity deals. Lionel Messi gets equity deals. These are generational talents with proven track records of generating billions in value. Cunningham was a role player who'd averaged under 9 points a game for her entire WNBA career. Yet here she was, at exactly the same financial table. Project B's executives understood something fundamental about the modern sports landscape. They understood that Sophie Cunningham could move needles. They understood that her ability to generate attention, to create buzz, to make people care, was worth paying for directly. What Project B saw was an athlete who'd already proven her ability to command national conversations without relying on traditional measurements of athletic excellence. She didn't need to average 20 points a night to move the meter. She just needed to be herself. She just needed to speak her mind. She just needed to refuse to be managed by institutional power structures. That was worth $2 million to a startup league trying to build an audience in international markets. That was worth equity. That was worth being treated as a business partner rather than just a player. $2 million traced directly back to one controversial foul and a summer of refusing to apologize for speaking her mind. The math was staggering when you actually did the calculation. Across 7 professional WNBA seasons, Cunningham's total base salary had added up to roughly $637,000, her entire career earning in the WNBA. The Project B contract alone represented more than 3 times that entire career total. Signed in a single afternoon on the strength of a brand the league's own fines had helped build. The fines that were meant to silence her had instead made her worth more. The league had essentially subsidized her rise to prominence. Few athletes in any sport have watched a single controversial play translate so directly into a life-changing business opportunity within a single calendar year. Most athletes build their way up. They work for years. They accumulate achievements. They build credibility through statistics and championships and longevity. Cunningham had built her way up in months through authenticity and refusal to comply with institutional management. The momentum didn't stop with Project B. 2026 brought a contributor role with USA Network's WNBA coverage and a feature in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. 2 opportunities that rarely find their way to role players averaging under 10 points a game. By the time industry analysts started estimating her net worth for 2026, the figure landed somewhere between $2 million and $3 million. Built almost entirely on endorsements, media work, and a single equity contract that traced its roots back to one retaliation foul in Indianapolis. She'd accumulated more wealth in a single year than she had in her entire previous professional career. And it wasn't from basketball excellence. It was from something deeper. It was from authenticity. It was from refusing to be silent. It was from understanding that in the modern sports landscape, your voice is often more valuable than your statistics. Sports business analysts who study athlete valuation started referencing Cunningham's case specifically when explaining how quickly modern sports economics can shift. A single viral moment properly leveraged could now outweigh years of traditional on-court production in terms of pure financial impact. Few case studies illustrated the point as cleanly as hers did. Her name started appearing in sports business coverage, far removed from typical basketball reporting. Business schools began citing her story as an example of personal brand leverage. She was becoming a case study in modern entrepreneurship. She was becoming a lesson in how to build value in the digital age. What made her particularly valuable to Project B specifically? League executives building a brand new international product needed a personality capable of generating attention without relying entirely on traditional star power. Cunningham fit that description perfectly. She'd already proven across an entire summer of finds and viral moments that she could command a national conversation without averaging 20 points a night. For a startup league trying to build an audience quickly, that kind of proven attention-generating ability was worth paying for directly. She was worth $2 million because she'd proven she could move the needle, because she'd proven she could create buzz, because she'd proven she could make people care. The question everyone started asking in retrospect was how the league got this so wrong. What was the WNBA actually trying to accomplish with 3 separate finds in a single season? Presumably, a quieter, more careful Sophie Cunningham. A player who'd think twice before posting critical content on social media. A player who'd self-censor. A player who'd understand that there are consequences for speaking up about perceived unfairness. Presumably, a return to the time before the foul, when nobody was talking about her at all. Instead, the league got the opposite outcome at every single turn. Each find generated headlines. Each headline generated new followers, new brand interest, and new proof that authenticity, even when it costs a few $100s at a time, resonates louder than almost anything a league's marketing department could script. Compare Cunningham's trajectory to a typical league-approved promotional campaign, and the contrast becomes immediately obvious. Marketing departments spend enormous budgets trying to manufacture exactly the kind of authentic, relatable personality Cunningham built for free simply by refusing to filter her honest reactions to what she saw on the floor. They'll hire agencies. They'll develop strategies. They'll focus group messaging. They'll craft statements word by word. They'll try to perfect every element of presentation. And the result is almost always something that feels corporate, something that feels inauthentic, something that audiences can immediately recognize as content developed by committee. No amount of scripted content, no carefully crafted messaging, no committee-approved statements could have generated the same organic reach as one athlete genuinely defending her teammate and then genuinely refusing to apologize for saying what she thought about the officiating that followed. The WNBA couldn't have manufactured a Sophie Cunningham if it tried. She couldn't be created in a boardroom. She couldn't be focus grouped into existence. She had to be authentic. She had to be real. She had to be someone willing to take consequences for speaking truth. That's what made her valuable. That's what made her different. That's what made her matter. Cunningham herself seemed to understand the dynamic better than anyone in the league office. She never treated the fines as a threat worth backing down from. She understood the math. She understood that the visibility was worth more than the money. She understood that every fine was actually helping her, not hurting her. She understood that in the modern sports landscape, punishment from institutions is often a sign that you're doing something right. By the time the 2026 season approached, she was openly joking about the entire saga on her own podcast. Discussing the officiating meetings the league had ahead of the new year, she said the refs had owned up to what happened last season. Then she asked, if they're starting to agree with what I've been saying the whole time, should I get my money back? It was humor, but it was also pointing directly at the absurdity of the situation. The league had fined her for being right. It had fined her for having valid criticism. It had fined her for speaking about things that turned out to be legitimate issues with how the league was being officiated. Then it came back and essentially admitted she'd been right all along. The meetings happened. The refs addressed the issues. The league tacitly acknowledged that Cunningham's criticism had been accurate. So here's a question that deserves to be asked. What was the point of the fines? What was the league actually trying to accomplish? If the goal was to improve the quality of officiating, then Cunningham had contributed to that goal more than the referees had. If the goal was to manage her voice, then the league had failed spectacularly. Does a league ever really win when its punishment becomes a player's origin story? It's hard to argue the WNBA came out ahead in this exchange. Every dollar in fines Cunningham paid over the course of the season amounted to a rounding error next to the value those same controversies generated for her personally. The league wanted compliance. What it created instead was one of the most recognizable personalities in the sport: a podcast host, a broadcaster, an equity partner in a league built to compete with the very organization that kept trying to fine her into silence. That's not a win. That's not even close to a win. Fans watching the entire saga unfold in real time seemed to understand what was happening before most media outlets fully caught on. Social media comment sections filled with the same joke over and over. Fine her again. Make her richer again. A running bit that captured the absurdity of the entire situation better than any formal analysis could. Fans understood the economics of the moment faster than the institutions trying to manage it. They understood what the league didn't: that Sophie Cunningham was becoming more valuable with every fine, that every attempt to silence her was actually amplifying her, that the WNBA was essentially funding her rise to prominence. The story of Sophie Cunningham offers a genuine blueprint for athletes navigating a sports landscape where authenticity increasingly outperforms caution. She never once apologized for a single comment that drew a fine. She never softened her public persona to appease league officials. She consistently framed every fine as simply the cost of speaking honestly about what she saw on the floor. That refusal to be managed, more than any single foul or podcast episode, is what turned $400 into a business worth millions. What started as a controversial play ended up becoming one of the most unexpected success stories in modern women's basketball. Every fine, every headline, every debate only made Sophie Cunningham's voice louder. She proved that in today's sports world, authenticity can be worth more than silence. That in today's landscape, the fines your league imposes might just be the best thing that ever happens to your personal brand. The WNBA set out to discipline a player for defending her teammate. Instead, it accidentally created a blueprint for success that other athletes are now studying. It transformed a role player into a multi-million-dollar brand. It turned a single moment of authentic emotion into a business empire. The biggest question now isn't whether the WNBA created a star. It clearly did. The question is what comes next. Will other players watch Cunningham's trajectory and decide that staying quiet isn't worth the cost anymore? The WNBA accidentally handed its players a roadmap for exactly how to turn league discipline into personal power. Whether other players follow that roadmap remains to be seen. But Sophie Cunningham proved it could be done, and that changes everything about how we understand athlete branding in the modern sports landscape.